Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out this evening. On behalf of the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's lecture, the second by our Bayard Dodge visiting professor for 2024, Professor Rachida Chih. As I explained last Saturday, the Bayard Dodge Distinguished Visiting Professorship is the highlight of our academic year. The program has been generously funded by the Cleveland H. Dodge Foundation since the mid-1980s in honor of the late Dr. Bayard Dodge, a scholar of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies who served as the third president of the American University of Beirut and who was himself a visiting professor here at AUC. This generous professorship allows us to host every year a leading scholar in the fields of Arabic and Islamic studies. The idea is to share with our students and faculty, but with Cairo at large, some of the more recent research in our fields. The visiting professor typically spends around a week with us, delivering public lectures and spending time with our faculty and students, including leading a methodology workshop. Over the years, we've been very lucky to invite a number of leading academics and intellectuals through this program. And this year, we've been quite fortunate that Professor Chih has accepted our invitation. I know that students and colleagues have been enjoying and benefiting from their discussions with her all week. Professor Chih is Senior Research Fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS. She studied at the University of Aix-Marseille, earning her doctorate in Arabic and Islamic Studies in 1996 and her habilitation in Islamic Studies in 2015. Last year, she was a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies at Kyoto University in Japan. And Dr. Chih knows Cairo and Egypt quite well, having spent a few years here working on her research and as research fellow at the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology, the IFAO. Professor Chih's research interests revolve around the history of Sufism, especially in Egypt and Morocco in the Ottoman and early modern periods. She has published 2 monographs. In 2000, a book in French on the Sufi orders in 20th century Egypt, and in 2019, her book, Sufism in Ottoman Egypt, Circulation, Renewal, and Authority in the 17th and 18th century. She's currently working on a book on the Prophet Muhammad in the mirror of his community, devotion, identity, and politics in modern Islam. And in relation to this interest, she has also recently edited with others the 3-volume work, The Presence of the Prophet in Early Modern and Contemporary Islam, which came out as part of the series Brill Handbook of Oriental Studies. She's also edited and co-edited a number of other books and published numerous book chapters and journal articles. Dr. Chih's research is quite interdisciplinary. It covers areas of both early modern and modern Sufism in 2 of the most important centers of Sufism, Egypt and Morocco, and brings together the intellectual study of Sufi ideas with that of practice and social history. Last Saturday, Professor Chih gave her first public lecture, which was related to her more recent work on devotional practices and devotional literature. That is, books that focus on the veneration of the Prophet Muhammad. The lecture focused in part on Al-Jazuli's Dalail al-Khayrat, a 15th century prayer book, which came to be quite popular since the 17th century and arguably up until today. And just in class the other day, one of our students brought his copy of Dalail al-Khayrat, so I thought that was quite an interesting touch. Her discussion brought together literary analysis of the text, its material history, in addition to the social and political histories of the periods in which this devotional literature spread and became more popular. Professor Chih's research covers the period before the modern, the 15th to the 18th centuries, which had long been dismissed as uninteresting periods of intellectual decline, a position that more recent research, including her own, has thankfully made obsolete. In tonight's lecture, Professor Chih will be speaking on Sufism in Ottoman Egypt, historiography, sources, and methodology. The lecture will explore what happened to Egyptian Sufi culture after Egypt became part of the Ottoman Empire, with a focus on the sources, the historiography, and the methodological approaches that she has used so far in her scholarship. As she put it in her abstract for the lecture, when the Ottomans conquered Egypt, bringing it into their vast modern empire, what happened to Egyptian Sufi culture? What was the impact on the social status of the Sufis, on their mosques, zawiyas, and mausoleums, on writings and their distribution, scholarly debates, rituals, and celebrations when Egypt became part of the Ottoman world? Today, we're all looking forward to this lecture. I'd also like to draw your attention to a very small book fair, as it were, outside the hall. Both the American University in Cairo Press and the IFAO publications are putting some of their books related to Sufism and Islamic studies on display and at a discounted price. So after the lecture and perhaps over coffee, you might want to peruse some of these titles. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chih.
Thank you very much, Amina. So good evening, everyone. So in the course of this second lecture, I'm going to talk about my research on Sufism and Sufi orders in pre-modern Egypt. My aim is not so much to detail the findings. I have published a book and several articles on the subject, but rather to explain the historiographical basis, the sources I have used, and the methodological choices I have made. So when the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517, as Amina explained, bringing it into the vast modern empire, what happened to Egyptian religious culture, what was the impact of the Ottoman conquest on places of worship, education, rituals, scholarly debates, writings, and their distribution. Wide-ranging questions such as these have driven my research on Sufism in Ottoman Egypt, and in order to begin answering them, we must first establish some historiographical guidelines. Religious history is not a well-developed field in Egyptian academia. As regards the history of modern Sufism in particular, which is my domain of research, a few monographs exist. I mentioned Tawfiq al-Tawil and Muhammad Sabri, but they are now dated, and they adopt an essentialist and ideological reading of the religious culture of that period, described in terms of decadence compared to an idealized origins or an Islamic golden age. Clearly, such approaches go against historical method, which requires one to abstain from judgment and try to read each work in its context. One does not read the Quran and the Sunnah in the same way today as during the Ottoman period. Every reading is an interpretation colored by the social and historical context of the reader. As a result, everything to do with the sacred must be studied both synchronically as a set of ideas and practices, and diachronically, acknowledging that these ideas are subject to history, used and understood differently according to the social and political context of specific times and cultures. Orientalists focused on the text of the medieval period, considering that anything produced later, particularly during Ottoman times, was but a pale reflection of that classical age. Some of them placed the beginning of this long and inexorable decline in the 13th century, while others located it as far back as the 11th. I refer you to the collective volume published in 1957, Classicism and Cultural Decline in the History of Islam. In France, the real advances from this position were made by scholars who had trained as historians and chosen to learn Arabic in order to specialize in the history of the Muslim societies. During the years from 1950 to 1960, while Orientalists were debating the alleged cultural decline of Islam, the first historian in France to specialize in the economic and social history of the medieval Muslim world, Claude Cahin, 1909-1991, brought about an epistemological turn that led away from Orientalism. His methodological manifesto, The Economic and Social History of the Muslim East, appeared in the journal Studia Islamica in 1955. Studia Islamica had been founded 2 years earlier in 1953 by two great specialists in Islamic jurisprudence, Robert Brunswick, who was French, and Joseph Schacht from Germany. The journal built in the new perspectives developed in l'École des Annales. This name, l'École des Annales, refers to Annales d'Histoire économique et sociale, a journal founded during the interwar period by Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch. The journal was founded on a program to break radically from traditional historiography and draw the attention of historians away from accounts of political events, conquests, battles and wars, revolutions, and towards profound economic, social, and cultural trends. The publication in 1924 of Marc Bloch's book on the attribution of miraculous powers of healing to the kings of France and England, this practice appeared in France around the year 1000 and faded away 8 centuries later, Les Rois Thaumaturges, was seen as a historiographical revolution, as Bloch introduced anthropology and the history of mentalities into the study of history. After the Second World War, French historian Fernand Braudel developed the Annales multidisciplinary project with his comprehensive approach, covering all aspects of history, sociological, economic, demographic, studied over a long duration, the longue durée, introducing the concept of, and I quote him, a nearly imperceptible passage of history. Brunswick and Schacht founded Studia Islamica on the basis of an observation. The impasse that for them Islamic studies had reached, and of a program, that of making their journal a space for discussion on methods and documentation in order to make new findings possible. Brunswick and Schacht approached their field, Islamic jurisprudence, as a dimension of social, economic, and political history, attempting to understand the significance that these normative systems had for social groups. In his introductory article for the first issue of Studia Islamica, Brunswick emphasizes that, and I quote him, "We are still in the dark about entire fields of research despite the fairly easily available documentation that would cast a light on them. There are whole periods and regions that remain outside the range of systematic exploration for which the essential preliminary work of elementary collection and critique of sources does not exist." Claude Cahin published his manifesto in the third issue of the journal, and he observes that therein that Oriental studies in France do not give students the aptitudes required, underlining the lack of preparedness of Arabists and Islamologists to approach the history of the Orient along the new perspectives opened up by the Annales school. Before that time, Orientalism had adopted philological, literary, and doctrinal approaches concentrating on the broadest political and ideological movements in Islam. Although their findings are valuable, it was now necessary to seek the material foundations of that history and above all to avoid projecting social and political institutions originating in Europe onto Muslim societies. Cahen became the principal editor of the Journal of the Economic and Social History of the Orient, the GESHO, from 1957. He also oversaw the doctorate thesis of André Raymond and Jean-Claude Garcin. If I mention these two historians in particular, among the many who were formed and influenced by Claude Cahen, it's not so much because I was the student at the University of Aix-en-Provence, but because the pioneering work on urban history as a way of opening a window into the social and economic life of Arab cities offered new research perspectives for scholars of Mamluk and Ottoman history, but also for those, such as myself, who study religious history. They laid some of the groundwork that allowed me to establish the correlations expected by Brunswick between religious culture and its social, economic, and political environment. It was clear that religious life evolved in and from material societies, and one could not understand it away from those foundations. So this approach explained why the real advances on the religious history of pre-modern Egypt were made by a specialist in urban history of the Mamluk period, Jean-Claude Garcin. Jean-Claude Garcin conceived urban history as inextricably related to social history and was one of the first to use the kinds of sources that until then had only been studied by historians of medieval Christianity, I mean hagiographical documents, the lives of saints. Garcin noted the presence of Sufis in the city of Cairo during the medieval period and attempted to evaluate their qualitative and quantitative importance by examining the built environment and assessing the number of constructions, some of which were monumental, that were reserved for Sufis, Ribat, Khanqa, Zawiya. Moreover, Garcin attempted to go beyond the inevitable limitations of the observation of architecture by complementing this with social analysis and combining historiographical and hagiographical sources. He found that Sufis were more visible in the late Mamluk period, when they often appeared as a recourse in the face of an unjust system. And this raised questions about the links between the spread of Sufism and economic and political changes. The exodus from the countryside due to epidemics and pressure from Bedouins, and the influx into 15th century Cairo of country dwellers who brought with them their forms of devotion to their local saints, affected cultural and social life, opening it up to the provinces and rural regions. This period marked the beginning of the great movements of the urban crowds who undertook annual pilgrimages to rural saints' sanctuaries in the Nile Delta. The work of Catherine Meyer-Jaouen on Ahmed el-Badawi confirms that the cult of this great saint of Tanta became established during the first half of the 15th century. On the basis of his reading of biographical and hagiographical dictionaries, especially Shahrani's Tabaqat, Jean-Claude Garcin concludes that Sufis provided the spiritual and social framework of society in some well-defined spaces. So I was able to benefit from the advances of the Aix-en-Provence Historical School on Egypt when I undertook my research on the history of Sufism in Ottoman Egypt for my habilitation after having worked on similar topics in the contemporary period for my doctoral thesis. I studied the history of Sufism in its institutions, the Sufi Brotherhood, Sufi orders, with a comprehensive approach covering all its aspects, spiritual, social, and political. Simply as a historian, but also probably because I worked on the contemporary period before going back in time to study the Ottoman era, I am concerned with questions of development and change and their chronology. I seek moments and spaces where shifts occur, the reasons behind them, and their social implications. And such changes in the fields of religious beliefs and practices and their social expressions are often hard to perceive. They are much more gradual than the surrounding political upheavals, which nevertheless affect them. One must adopt Fernand Braudel's approach and distinguish between different historical time scales. First, the time that seems motionless or that evolves silently out of the long duration, that is the traditional time of humanity against its backdrop of religions, arts, mentalities, or else the time scale of states and politics, or finally that of events at the level of the individual. When I was working on my doctoral thesis in the 1990s, my field of research was dominated by modernist theses first set out in the 1960s. These predicted a continuous and irreversible decline of Sufism and the Sufi brotherhoods in the face of a modernization that would demand other forms of Islam. For example, rationalist reformism. The realities that I was observing in the field in Egypt did not accord with this outlook at all, despite the absence of governmental support for Sufism and also the appearance of groups that opposed Sufism. Not only the Sufi brotherhoods resisted the profound changes of the long 20th century, they had also demonstrated great vitality and the capacity for adapting to modernity. And far from being a refuge for superstitious illiterates, the brotherhood on which I had chosen to work for my PhD research, the Khalwatiyya, had been propagated by scholarly men educated at Al-Azhar with strong ties to their villages. In defiance of modernist thesis that situated the decline of Sufism in the end of the 19th century under the influence of Western positivist thinking and of the rise of Islamic reformism, it was precisely at that time and beginning from the University of Al-Azhar that the Khalwatiyya spread in the Nile Valley. Reading of the long and rich chapter dedicated to the Sufis in Gilbert de Lannoux, seminal Muslim moralists and politicians in 19th century Egypt, which was published by the IFAO in 1982, I realized that the roots of this diffusion were even deeper, going back to the 18th century, and this is what sparked my interest in the Ottoman period. But when I came to examine the 18th century more closely, I came across another thesis of decline, familiar to every historian of Ottoman Egypt, that of Ottoman decline. And because I was studying Sufism, I also came across the notion of neo-Sufism, which was later adopted by historians under the umbrella term revival. Broadly speaking, the term neo-Sufism was invented during the 1960s by a Muslim modernist thinker and scholar from today's Pakistan, Fazlur Rahman, who taught at the University of Chicago. Rahman defines neo-Sufism as, I quote him, Sufism reformed on orthodox lines and interpreted in an activist sense. He used the term to define a puritanical reformist movement in Islam that was born during the 18th century among new reformist Sufi orders, such as the Tijaniya, the Sanusiya, and the Naqshbandiya Mujaddidiya, as a reaction to the new political and economic realities of the modern world, characterized by the rise of Europe and the supposed decline of the Muslim world. For Rahman, this reformed and militant Sufism had broken away, on the one hand, from the pantheistic and quietist medieval Sufism of the Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi, and on the other from superstitions around the cult of saints that Rahman felt had corrupted the true nature of Islam, especially in his birthplace, India, reaffirming a scrupulous attachment to the Sharia and to the moral example of the Prophet. Neo-Sufism was thus presented as a group of social-political movements that swept the anti-Muslim world during the 19th century and unequivocally and ineluctably brought about Islamic reformism. Fazlur Rahman made value judgments on Islam. His approach was dogmatic and ahistoric, and it had nothing to do with the realities of the period he studied. He sought to describe an ideal of Islam rather than a specific period of its history. For him, Islam was not a set of practices and beliefs to which Muslims adhered at one point in history, but an absolute truth to which some were faithful and others were not. He considered historical Islam to be a heritage that was better dispensed with in order to return to the original message of Islam. So rather than being the result of an attentive and contextualized reading of the sources, his approach was guided by the reformist and modernist thesis of the Orientalists who dominated social sciences for much of the 20th century, into whose company Rahman was initiated during his studies at Oxford University when he was a student of the British Orientalist Hamilton Gibb, author with Harold Bowen of the well-known Islamic Society and the West. The sources for Rahman's book were reports from colonial administrators for whom every Sufi was a militant fanatic ready to launch a jihad against Christian enemies, and Orientalist writings on the cult of saints, including Ignaz Goldziher's foundational text, which associates the cult of saints with the surviving fragments of fundamentally heterodox and quasi-pagan rural societies. Thus, an Orientalist and reformist vision of an Islam that had passed through its golden age and into a decadence of Sufi brotherhoods influenced Rahman's vision of history. Such ideas were taken up during the 1980s under another name, Revival, by researchers whose sources were the Arabic language biographical dictionaries of the 17th and 18th century. These researchers developed the idea that transnational networks of Arabic, Indian, and Asian Sufi scholars had been based in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and that these were at the origin of a reformist Sufi renewal that John Vol defined as, I quote him, a reorientation of the Islamic tradition along the lines advocated by Ibn Taymiyyah as Muslims from various walks of life sought to purify and revitalize their understanding of their faith through a return to the fundamentals of Scripture. At the same time that they saw the social-moral reconstruction of society. And this form of Sufism was very distant from the apolitical universe of Ibn Arabi. So when I was a PhD student, the academic world, especially in Germany, was deeply divided over these questions of decline and revival during the 18th century. The main argument against Rahman and those who upheld a thesis of revival, a revival supposed to have spread thanks to the new mobilities and intellectual networks occurring in the great modern Muslim empires, was that they didn't have sufficient knowledge of the writings of the Sufis whom they qualified as reformers, and that they had neglected the long duration of the movements they were studying. This critique of the concept of neo-Sufism or of a Sufi revival in the 18th century provoked a complete re-evaluation of Islam and Sufism during the modern period, but most particularly during the 18th century. Many important Sufi figures who had been presented as reformers were re-examined in the light of their own writings. Shah Wali Allah, who died in 1762, and Ahmed Shahid Barelvi, who died 1831 in India, Ahmed ibn Idris, who died in 1837, and his students Muhammad al-Sanusi and Muhammad al-Mirghani in North and East Africa. And these studies confirmed that in matters of doctrine, concepts, and practices, the modern period did not coincide with the rupture either with medieval Sufism or with Ibn Arabi. On the contrary, scholars in the Haramain, and in particular in Medina, were diffusing his ideas in writings that underline connection to the metaphysical reality of the Prophet, the Haqiqa Muhammadiyah. Despite this reappraisal of 18th and 19th century Sufism, the academic debate is not extinguished, because when trying to grasp the historical evolution of Sufi ideas and practices, the textual approach has its limits. Writings, as I said before, must be seen in the historical and material context of their production, circulation, and reappropriation. If we stick only to a textual approach, the Sufi writings of the Ottoman period present us with little that is new, simply reproducing concepts that were fixed in medieval times. However, there are certainly new political and economic conditions surrounding the circulation of writings during the Ottoman era. And my research sought to understand how Sufi accommodated these new conditions. I approached the study of the history of Sufism in Ottoman Egypt through the expansion of the Khalwatiyya, examining two temporalities, that of the long duration of the history of Sufi ideas and practices, and that of the Ottoman rule. I have also distinguished two special mobilities, circulations between Cairo and the countryside, the Egyptian provinces, and between Cairo and the rest of the Muslim world. In his manifesto, Claude Cain called for broadening horizons in the investigation of documents, for the discovery of previously unknown and unexplored historical sources. In my work on Sufism and in its spiritual and institutional dimensions, I cross-referenced different types of narrative sources, historical chronicles, local histories, Sufi handbooks, and hagiographies, with archival documents, mainly Waqf deeds. The point of departure of my research was a three-volume unpublished local history of Girga in Upper Egypt. It was written by a native of the town, Mohammed al-Maraghi al-Girgawi, 1865-1942, and it's called تعتير النواحي والأرجاء بالذكر من اشتهر من علماء وأعيان مدينة السعيد Girga, the lands and regions sweetly scented with the memory of the ulama and notables of the town of Girga in Upper Egypt. I had read of this 700-page manuscript's existence in the above cited work by Gilbert Delanoux, moraliste et politique musulman. In the introduction to this book, Gilbert Delanoux admitted that he had initially embarked on the search for the man and text of the Egyptian Enlightenment inaugurated by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798-1801 and taken up by the reforms of the Khedive Muhammad Ali and his successors. However, when he examined the period's writings in the library catalogues, in which he had expected to uncover the genesis of Islamic modernism, he found instead glosses, treatises, and brochures that demonstrated that he had underestimated the persistence and permanence through the 19th century of a tradition in which Sufism occupied a central place. And among the vast documentation that Delanoux has brought out of obscurity, making his work a veritable anthology, he mentions in a footnote the existence of al-Maraghi's manuscript on the political, religious, and cultural history of Upper Egypt. So the manuscript on Girga is written in the traditional format of local history, combining topographical history, khitat, and biographies, tabaqat. Like all local histories, this work has an apologetic aspect, glorifying the town's great past, fadail, great past, which is called to mind today by the beautiful Ottoman-era mosques that have resisted the ravages of time and the Nile's flooding. Al-Maraghi gives historical details of the foundation of religious and public buildings in the town and of the members of the military elite who financed the construction, the local ulama who were trained and held various positions in them, the saintly figures around whose tombs an ancient or more recent cult had grown up, essentially the history of a whole town, of its urbanization, and of the development of cultural and religious life there over almost 4 centuries, from the 15th century to the end of the 19th. And Maraghi relied on court records that no longer exist today, and he also drew on oral history and indicates that some of his contemporaries wrote their own biographical entries. Reading the manuscript reveals the existence of intensive construction activity in Girga during the 17th century and to a lesser extent, the 18th, under the patronage of the emirs of military households who had made Girga their home. They invested part of the revenues from their land-based wealth in the construction of Zawiya, Sabil Kuteb, public bath, and mosque, bearing their names. The photo shows Girga's Ali Bey Mosque. Ali Bey was Hakim Girga from 1634 to 1653, and the mosque of Amir Othman al-Kazdogli al-Girgawi, dated 1743, which is the last Ottoman mosque built in Girga. It is to Muhammad Bey Hakim Girga from 1653 to 1657 that we owe a Sunni mosque, probably so called because of glazed ceramic that covered its walls. And the Suyuti Mosque was built in 1759-1760 by Abdurrahman al-Khayyat, a member of an important local family of ulama. And indeed, during the 18th century, the names of Hawara tribal chiefs and local ulamas appear as founders of new mosque and zawiya. I was able to access a private archive, the Waqfiyya of the foundations of Abdejawad al-Ansari, who died in 1789. And these consisted of 2 mosques and 1 zawiya, quite simply the biggest waqf established in Girga by a local family. And I published this archive in the journal Annales Islamologiques. And it lists the lands whose revenues were dedicated to the functioning and maintenance of these religious institutions, and offers a unique description of the land-based wealth in the form of rizqa ihbasiyya accumulated by a local Girga family in the 18th century. So the mosque founded in Girga trained the ulama that every town requires. In his oeuvre, Al-Khitat al-Tawfiqiyya al-Jadida, Ali Pasha Mubarak had counted 20 Ottoman-era mosques in Girga, which resemble, he writes, those of Cairo. And these mosques and zawiya offered positions for men of religion from the most modest and poorly paid, requiring minimal qualification, muezzins, imams, readers of the Quran, to the most prestigious, such as teaching, jurisprudence, mufti, and khatib, in the town's biggest and most richly endowed mosques. And the best positions were monopolized by few families, the Khayyat, the Qattan, the Masri, the Suyuti, who passed them on in quasi-hereditary fashion. And these were the same families who sent their sons to Al-Azhar, and it is through these families that the Khalwatiyya will establish itself in the region. This historiographical source on the town of Girga shows the development of local centers of learning that provided an education that prepared students for higher studies at Al-Azhar. And by looking at it alongside the hagiography of the founder of the Khalwatiyya in Egypt, Muhammad ibn Salim al-Hifni, who died 1767, I was able to cast light on the political, social, and material circumstances surrounding the rapid expansion of the Sufi order in Egypt in the second half of the 18th century onwards, starting from the University of Al-Azhar, where Sheikh al-Hifni held the highest position, that of Sheikh al-Azhar, from 1757 to his death. The hagiography of Sheikh al-Hifni, whose full title is منتهى العبارات في بعض ما لشيخنا من المناقب والكرامات, incomparable words on the virtues and prodigies of our Sheikh, is an exceptional document, and it would certainly be worthy of publication in an academic edition. It was written during the Sheikh's lifetime and probably under his supervision, and it contains a whole chapter on the circumstances surrounding al-Hifni's encounter with his master, Mustafa al-Bakri, who died 1749, who came from Syria, his initiation into the Khalwatiyya, and the disciples he subsequently initiated, سلوكه في الطريقة السادة الخلواتية وبيان خلفائه والآخذين عنه. And most of these men were Azhari of provincial origin, who he then sent back to their home regions with authorization, izn, from the master to spread the path. So the movement of students from the Egyptian countryside, the Egyptian provinces, to Cairo began as early as the 15th century, as historians Karl Petrie and Jean-Claude Garcin have noted. At the time of the Mamluk madrasas, intellectual life and teaching were dominated by foreigners from Syria, Iraq, Iran. But the ruralization of the city of Cairo in the late medieval period, witnessed by Jean-Claude Garcin, and the new openness to the countryside, particularly to the Delta, that this brought about, led to an increase in the number of Egyptian students at Al-Azhar who were integrated into the Riwaq, the colleges system there. Jean-Claude Garcin refers to Al-Azhar at this time as a figure of Egyptianness that was to influence thus vast stretches of the Muslim world during the Ottoman period. The Ottomans continued the religious policies of the Mamluks, assigning numerous waqfs to the University of Al-Azhar, and this confirmed its international stature, attracting numerous international students, but also growing numbers of provincial students, Egyptian provincial students. During the 18th century, the mosque underwent its most significant transformations since its foundation by the Fatimids in the 10th century, thanks to Emir Abdurrahman Katkhuda al-Kasdoghli, who died 1776. He enlarged the prayer hall and created colleges for students from Upper Egypt, the holy cities, and Bilad al-Takrur in West Africa, and endowed the mosque, funding the creation of several teaching chairs and supporting numerous students. The 1760 Waqfiyya, marking the foundation of the first college for students from Upper Egypt. Until this time, they had been accommodated in the Maghrebi Riwaq because the Maghrebi and Upper Egyptian were from the same mazhab, Maliki mazhab. So this Waqfiyya is conserved in the archives of the Ministry of Awqaf. The first sheikh of the Riwaq, appointed for life by the emir, was Ali Saidi al-Adawi, who died in 1775. From the town of Beni Adi, as his nisba indicates. He was succeeded on his death by another Adawi, Ahmed al-Dardir al-Adawi, who died 1786. And thenceforth, Adawi would control the Saidi Riwaq until the end of the 19th century. These elements provide an understanding of the expansion of the Khalwatiyya in Upper Egypt. It stems from two important events: Ahmed al-Dardir's initiation by Sheikh al-Hifni into the Khalwatiyya and the nomination of Dardir as Sheikh of the Upper Egyptian Students' College and as Maliki Mufti after the death of Ali Saidi al-Adawi, who was an Ahmadi. So all the branches of the Khalwatiyya in Upper Egypt today go back to students and disciples of Ahmed al-Dardir at Al-Azhar. In Girga, the Khalwatiyya was brought by a member of the Khayyat family, Abd al-Mun'im al-Khayyat al-Girgawi. Al-Maraghi, the author of the history of Girga, regarded Abd al-Mun'im al-Khayyat, to whom he gives the honoring title Sheikh al-Mashayikh, master among masters, as one of Girga's most eminent scholars. He went to study at Al-Azhar, where he was initiated into the Khalwatiyya by Ahmed al-Dardir, and upon his return from Al-Azhar, Ad-Nunaym al-Khayyat held prominent positions in the town's great mosques and was able to, in turn, to initiate members of important local families such as the Masri and the Suyuti to the Khalwatiyya. Thus, there are three principal forces that made possible the expansion in Egypt of the Ottoman Khalwatiyya. The development of institutions in provincial towns, providing sufficient training for young boys and men to allow them to pursue higher education at Al-Azhar. The evolution of Al-Azhar itself under the Ottomans to become the highest center of religious learning in the country, with new colleges to accommodate this increase in provincial students, and the continuing position of Cairo as an intellectual crossroads for numerous foreign scholars, particularly from the Near East and the Maghreb. Al-Bakri, who was from Damascus, visited Cairo 3 times. He initiated Sheikh al-Hifni and other prominent scholars upon his first visit in the 1720s. He finally settled in the city where he died in 1749 and was buried. Pioneering articles by Afaf al-Lutfi and Said Marsour have analyzed the political and economic functions of the great ulama of the 18th century. The religious establishment consisted of the 2 families of Ashraf, descendants of the Prophet, the Bakri and the Sadat, and the great ulama of Al-Azhar, headed by the Sheikh of Al-Azhar. The rise of Al-Azhar as the largest center for religious learning under the Ottomans strengthened the prestige of its ulama. André Raymond noted their role as intermediaries between the elites and the people during periods of political instability and popular protest. These studies by Marceau and Raymond, although valuable, are descriptive and based on chronicles, mainly Jabartis, and on archives. In my own research, I sought to uncover the underlying forces that had brought these ulama to bear such political and economic weight in society. I was interested in the ideological roots of this powerful position of the ulama, who were also Sufis, and in the nature of the social relations that were established between those who pledge allegiance to them, be they the powerful or the common people. For this purpose, I have used 2 types of sources that have been little used by historians: hagiographies and Sufi handbooks. There is a wealth of such texts from the Ottoman period at Dar al-Kutub and in the library of Al-Azhar waiting to be explored. I will avoid going deeply into the importance of these documents for the cultural and social history of pre-modern Egypt and the methodological questions their use raises for historians, as these issues will be covered in my workshop for graduate students next Thursday. But the obituary of Sheikh al-Hifni in the chronicles of Jabarti provides elements for understanding these ideological roots. Sheikh al-Hifni died before the morning of Saturday, 17th of Rabi' Awal, 1181. He was buried on Sunday after prayers in a great gathering at Al-Azhar. It was a very solemn occasion. 13 days separated his death from that of Sheikh al-Malawi. From then on, affliction began to descend on Egypt and conditions began to deteriorate, confirming what Raghib Pasha had said, that al-Hifni's existence had sheltered the people of Egypt from affliction. Indeed, it is a clearly perceived fact that if there is no one among men to speak the truth openly, enjoin the right, forbid the wrong, and establish guidance, the order of the world becomes corrupt. and men's hearts are filled with dissension. When dissension fills men's heart, affliction follows. The millstone doesn't turn without its axis, and Al-Hifni was the pole of Egypt. So for Jabarti, Sheikh Al-Hifni was more than just a Sufi, an important Sufi scholar. By giving him the title of Pole, Qutb, the axis of the word, he is expressing his opinion that Al-Hifni was the greatest living saint of his time, and thus testifying to a belief that was deeply anchored among 18th century Egyptian Muslims, whether they formed part of the scholarly elite, like Jabarti, of the political class, like Rari Pasha, who was Ottoman governor of Egypt in 1746, then Grand Vizier of the Ottoman state, or of the masses, the belief in the presence of saints, those friends of God, awliya Allah, who during their lives, as after their deaths, act on the word. For sainthood in Islam signifies more than just a special bond with God. This bond implies a concrete power over the word and the beings who inhabit it. As clearly formulated by Jabarti, the role of saints is to assist and protect humanity and to take upon themselves the calamities of the word. Thanks to the presence and permanent intercession of the saints, the word continues to exist. The saints were, in fact, the guarantors of stability in a society that was prey to constant and often violent political upheavals. For the Egyptian Sufi Sha'rani, I quote him, "If the spiritual pole who is at the head of the hierarchy of the saint and his entourage did not bear the trials of the word would be destroyed in an instant." Some of the loftiest of saints were thought to share in the same metahistorical presence and timeless omniscience of the prophet. During the 17th century, an oral legend characteristic of Egyptian Sufism is written down, that of the cosmic hierarchy of the four poles, Al-Aqtab Al-Arba'a. Manaqib Al-Aqtab Al-Arba'a, also called Al-Tabaqat Al-Sharnubiyya, as it was dictated by Ahmed Al-Sharnubi to his disciple Muhammad Al-Burkini. These four saints are the two Egyptian patron saints, Ahmed Al-Badawi, died 1276, Ibrahim al-Disuqi, died 1296, alongside the Iraqi saints, Ahmed al-Rifai, died 1182, and Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, died 1166. They lead the celestial assembly that governs the world at a time when the Sufi brotherhoods, the Ahmadiyya, Burhamiyya, Rifai, and Qadiriyya, had woven a dense fabric of mosques, zawiyya, and small mausoleums to mark out their territory across Egypt. The hagiography of Sheikh Al-Hifni, which we study in detail during the workshop, has a specific function: to provide proof of the Sheikh's sainthood and to arouse devotion to him in the same way that the Sirah provides proof of Muhammad's prophethood. The hagiography of Sheikh Al-Hifni is the narrative of a divine election, a predestination, and compile a collection of actions that can be recognized as attributes and signs of this election. The wali is the one who has, through his works and virtues and through divine election, approached God. This makes him a protégé, a wali of God. And in return, he dispenses to mankind the graces with which God has blessed him, the barakah. But in order to benefit from this barakah, which takes several forms, spiritual blessings, material assistance, arbitration, intercession, one must establish a specific relationship of allegiance to the saint and behave according to specific social codes, to specific social codes described in Sufi manuals. In order to analyze the model of social life that the Sufis established within their communities, I examined 3 manuals from the 17th and 18th century for aspirants to this path of the Khalwatiyya. السير والسلوك by Khani, تحفة السالكين by Samanudi, and تحفة الإخوان في آداب الطريق وأحمد الدردير. The first Sufi manuals appeared between the 9th and the 11th century with the evolution of Sufism towards collective ways of life. But the genre really spread with the formation of the great Sufi orders in the 13th century with classics such as Sohrawardi's Awarif al-Ma'arif, the benefits of intimate knowledge. They document a set of norms of behavior, adab, and define the respective status of both master and disciples, their rights and obligations. These handbooks are indicative of the importance given by Sufi to adab, proper behavior of the masters and their disciples above asceticism and religious science. In Sufi manuals, 3 terms define the master-disciple relationship: sohba, companionship; khidma, service; and shafa'a, intercession, mediation. These are polysemous concepts with social and political implications. Khidma, service, has a double meaning. The disciples are at the service of the sheikh, who is at the service of his disciples. The pact, al-'aqd, that is sealed between master and disciple is a reciprocal one. And the mubay'a, the Arabic roots of this word, relates to contract between a buyer and seller, is conditional. The disciple submits to his sheikh, and in exchange, the latter promises to direct him on the path towards God, but also to protect him, to give him succor. During the ceremony of allegiance, master and disciple both kneel facing each other with their knees touching, each holding the other's right hand. This mirroring symbolizes their reciprocity. Thus, the walaya, proximity to God, implies a notion of patronage. The saint in his community reproduces reciprocal loyalty and solidarity between patrons and clients, transposing them to another plane and directing them towards a different spiritual goal. The hagiography of Sheikh al-Hifni contains numerous clues relating to the social structure of his clientele. Initially, his network was made of students and teachers at Al-Azhar. For provincial students, the Sheikh's protection, which is acquired through affiliation to his path, the Khalwatiyya, makes them part of a powerful web of integration and solidarity in Cairo and in the university. In return, these students become active propagators of al-Hifni's Sufi path throughout the country. According to his hagiographer, Sheikh al-Hifni regularly brought together 40, 50, up to 60 people, including princes and sultans, for far-flung places, as well as poverty-stricken people who are granted what they've asked for in this world and the next. The Sheikh gives his all, keeping nothing back for himself. He was generous, writes Jabalti, and gave up everything he had because he considered this world's goods to be of little value. This redistribution is thus perceived at once as a criterion of prestige and an attribute of sainthood. Shir al-Hifni offers charity openly and also more discreetly at his house, Beit. An ardab of wheat bread is served each day, and his mill never stops grinding. He has constant supply of coffee and sweet drinks flowing day and night for his visitors. Most of these visitors are students at Al-Azhar who come to ask for support because living conditions at the university are difficult. The Sheikh reaches down to his rag and pulls out some dirham, distributing them to the students. The story of Al-Mahdi, a young Copt who at an early age was entrusted by his father to Shir al-Hifni in order to receive a Muslim education and who later became a great alim, like his master, taking up an important post at Al-Azhar, has clear parallels with the practices of military households where young boys purchased as slaves are brought up in the palaces of emirs and sultans whose faithful servants they then become. The hagiography of Shir al-Hifni is made of 3 parts, the last of which is entirely devoted to poems praising and glorifying him. These poems recognize the stature of the Sheikh as a man of charisma and power, bearing witness to devotion and allegiance to his person. Praise poetry was declaimed in salon, majalis, in the private homes of the patrician elite and of important ulama and merchants. Jabarti informs us that al-Hifni had his own majlis and poet, Abdullah al-Idkawi, whom he had recruited after the death of the poet's previous patron, Sheikh Abdullah Shubrawi, al-Hifni's predecessor at the head of Al-Azhar. I quote Jabarti, Al-Idkawi became his companion at home and on his travels. He praised him in his best poems and in return received his attention, protection, and alms enough to live on. We do not know the extent of Al-Hifni's wealth, but we have clues as to its origins. His hagiographer says he had received gifts of land from emirs and governors. Regardless of the form it took, for his disciples, Al-Hifni's true riches were symbolic rather than material. His capital was his charisma, to use terms drawn from Weberian sociology. He was rich because he benefited from God's divine protection, walaya, and from barakah. He had God's goodwill. Jabarti writes, كل من طلب شيئا من أمور الدنيا والآخرة وجده كان رزقه فيضا إلهيا. So to conclude, I would like to return to the question with which we began with, namely the impact of the Ottoman conquest of Egypt and its integration into a vast modern empire on religious culture and Sufism in particular. Sufism continued to progress in Egypt under the Ottomans until it occupied a preponderant place in society. But our improved knowledge of the social and economic history of Egypt since the pioneering work of the French historian André Raymond, followed by those of the Egyptian School on Ottoman history, had allowed us to refine the chronology of the history of pre-modern Sufism and to observe therein one major inflection. After a time of transition and instability during the 16th century, from the beginning of the 17th century, the increased stability and integration into the country of the Ottoman political elites allowed them to participate in Egypt's economy and, thanks to their wealth, to act as patrons for numerous pious foundations, each of which provided a space for the development of a religious culture into which Sufism was integrated. The vast Sufi literature of this period may not be fundamentally new, but it is indicative of this new and probably unprecedented expansion of Sufi orders and their deeper roots in society. This literature is made of biographies and hagiographies of Sufi masters whose lives and insights may be exemplary for their disciple. Many treatises on the stage of the Sufi path, litanies and prayers to accompany the practice of the zikr, the invocation within the Sufi orders, and prayers and panegyrics and praises of the prophets, which aim to nourish popular piety and an increasingly visible devotion to God's messenger. There has also been an evolution in the hagiographic genre, which we will examine in more details during the workshop. The hagiography of Shir al-Hifni dates from the later part of the genre's history, which begins in the 11th century. It both inherits from this long tradition and is part of an evolution whose beginnings can be dated in the 15th century, from hagiographies of a saintly figure towards productions anchored in a brotherhood foundation whose memory, religious identity, and teaching of a founder must be preserved. In these late hagiographies, the influence of the ideas of Ibn Arabi and his doctrine of sainthood inherited from prophethood, and the claim by Sufis of the late Mamluk period, such as Suyuti and Sha'rani, of mystical intimacy with the Prophet, who guided them and inspired them, projecting themselves as mujaddid of his sunnah through mystical inspiration, is particularly striking. This indicates that the arrival of the Ottomans did not constitute a rupture with the Mamluk period. On the contrary, the changes that occurred during the course of the 15th century would have an impact on the Sufism of the Ottoman period. The mystical concept of tajdid, of renewal, continued well into the 19th century. Among the religious figures who were firmly rooted in the Sufi heritage of the previous centuries and who took part in the resistance against European imperialism or in jihad against local opponents. In fact, thanks to research on Sufism in other parts of the Muslim world, in India, Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa, we can now develop another view of the history of Islam in the long 19th century, quite different from the view of a century swept by an enlightenment introduced by European imperialism and colonization, a view that ignored the permanence of an entire field of thought dominated by Sufism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Again, another very thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure we have a number of questions and comments, and we have a number of microphones around the hall, so we can pass them around.
Thank you, Doctor, for your talk. It was very enlightening. You mentioned at the very end something about the Sufi energies being redirected towards anti-imperialism. But maybe I came late or something, but I didn't really hear much about the anti-imperialist aspect of Sufi action in Egypt. So can you speak more on that?
Yeah, so the leaders, the religious leaders who took part to the resistance to imperialism were Sufis, but they were for a long time presented by a kind of reformist, nationalist history as the first reformists of Islam. But indeed, they inherited, for example, okay, so let me give, I'm not a specialist of Sufism in India, but I have read enough. They were heirs of Shah Wali Allah. So Shah Wali Allah, he was presented by a nationalist history as a kind of Puritan whose aim was to denounce the corruption that was introduced into Islam, to you know, in order to purify and what that would have been the cause of decline. But Shah Waliullah was very much an Akbarian Sufi, and he even claimed a superior status than the status that was claimed by Ibn Arabi himself as seal of the saints. Shah Waliullah claimed to be in direct communication with God. And if we read carefully his reading, he's really gave himself a very elevated status. I'm mentioning Shah Waliullah, but I can mention Ahmed Tijani, I can mention Ahmed Idris. All these masters, they inspired the religious leaders in the 19th century who took part to resistance against imperialism and all to some jihads against local opponents to create a new political entity. I have in mind Al-Hajj Omar Tal, who created the Caliphate of Sokoto in today's Nigeria. So they were all really inspired by the ideas of Ibn Arabi, and they pushed these ideas even in more extreme because they were competing with each other. So they claim to be not only the highest spiritual authority, but they claimed that their own brotherhood integrates all the former brotherhoods. Like Islam, you know, is the last religion, they claim that their brotherhood is the last brotherhood. The Tijani claimed that the Tijaniya include all the spiritual paths that preceded and sealed them. And he gave himself. So there is a wrong idea that the leaders that took part to the resistance, they were really, not only they were Sufis, but really they gave themselves a status. The reason why people think that they were kind of neo-Wahhabi is because there is a misunderstanding. Indeed, they were also Puritans. They were also claiming that Islam has been corrupted, that Sufis introduced bid'ah, and they were fighting the bid'ah. But this is so much part of Islamic tradition. Each time that a new leader wants to take power, he will start claiming that the society is corrupted and we need to reform, we need to go back to the time of the Prophet. But this is a topoi of Islamic history. So that's, I mean, you know, for example, I presented the work of Jazuli, the Dalail al-Khairat last week. But Jazuli was also very puritanical. But he wrote Risalat al-Mahabba, and he pretended that he was really an incarnation of the Prophet. And so the reason why we have this misunderstanding, because of Orientalism, we make this dichotomy between tradition and reformism, between Sufi and Salaf. The Orientalism has created a dichotomic view of Islam that has really influenced the way we understand it. You know what I mean? It's more complex. When we need to go back to this complexity of debates and
thank you for this presentation, marvelous presentation. When I read something about the Sufism in Egypt, I found that all the symbols of Sufism in Egypt are not from Egypt. They are not Egyptian in birth. They are coming from outside Egypt. And I found that in Europe, it was the era of Renaissance. And in the Middle East and in Egypt, began to we can say, the era of darkness. Is there any implications of that?
Of this idea that the Sufis coming from abroad brought an era of darkness in Egypt. And anyway, I mentioned at the beginning the Tawfiq Tawil. He wrote this book, Tasawwuf al-Asr al-Osmani, and and he brought this idea of a decline of Islam, and with the link to the Sufi brotherhoods. But that was really part of his time. He wrote this in the 1940s. It was a time of reformism, and but of course Sufis they traveled, and Ahmed al-Badawi is supposed to be coming from al-Maghrib, but he's very much Egyptian. He was adopted by Egyptian. He was the Hassan al-Shazi. Because I mean that's. There was during the Ottoman, before, there was a movement of Maghrebi Sufis during the medieval period. And that's why Ibn Arabi came to Abu Madian. And this was studied by many scholars of this movement of Maghrebi to the Near East, and Abd al-Qadir Jilani and Rifai come from Iraq. But it was a time of mobilities and travels and encounters. And the point is that you have to remember that during the Ottoman period, Damascus and Cairo were the departures of the two Hajj caravan, and this had a huge impact on Cairo as a crossroads for people would come and wait for months before taking on with the caravans.
Thank you very much for this edifying lecture. Do you limit your sources to hagiographies and handbooks? Because travel literature at that period was interesting. And I want to hear your take on the Awliya Shelebi, or Avliya Shelebi. He's a Turkish traveler. He has written a 10-volume travel book, writing one whole volume on Egypt. And he probably was a Khalwati too, or had connections to Khalwatis.
I think it's a very good question. I really think we should do a project on this Rahalat. Really, I had this in mind for a long time, and they are so rich. I think this is unique to the Islamic world because of the necessity to travel to the Haramain, so this Rahalat could be also called intellectual pilgrimages. And because it was the occasion for scholars to stop to different places, because along the itinerary to Mecca, there was another many secondary itinerary where scholars would stop, and this Rahalat, they mention the people they met, the books they saw in the Zawiya, the books they exchanged, the books they copied, and so they really give flesh to this history of Islamic culture, and also they give flesh to the people and to the necessity of their social relationship, because the culture go through social relationships. And what were the social relationships? How were they established, between who and how? And until we don't do this, we will still talk of Islam of something which is hors sol. I don't know how to say it but not linked to history, and to historicize our Islam is so important. So, and this. Yes, then this Rahalat are hugely important. I know that Moroccans, they have published a lot of these because Moroccans traveled a lot to, because of the situation at the end of the, so, during the 17th and 18th century, the renewal of mobilities brought a renewal of the genre. And I didn't mention this part of my research, but Hifni was in contact with great Maghrebi scholars who wanted to be initiated by him. And you will be surprised by the two great founders of North African Brotherhood, the Tijaniya and the Rahmaniya in Algeria, were initiated by Al-Hifni. So the Tijaniya stem from the Khalwatiya, and the Rahmaniya the same. That's why Fazlur Rahman put also the Khalwatiya among those reformist Sufi orders. It was really important. 18th century was an important crossroads. Cairo was an important crossroads for Maghrebi, like it was in the medieval period when Shazili traveled there, when Ibn Arabi, when many, I'm not a specialist of this period, but, and there were, so this movement of Maghrebi was very intense during the medieval period, and then it stopped due to, I think, crusades, and then it was a renewed movement during the Ottoman period.
Awliya Shilbi, he was Turkish, so...
Yeah.
So basically it's, and he has, in the 10th volume, he has described the Mawlid Sayyid al-Badawi and in an extensive way. So it seems even the Turks were very well aware of what was going on.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I have lots of questions, but I'll ask one, which is about the kind of the rural context, right? I mean, so we struggle, even though we have lots of written documents in Egyptian history, to sometimes tell the history of rural Egypt, you know, the history of outside the city. I mean, how important it is for your work to actually think about writing a rural history of Egypt? I mean, is that how you think about it? Do you think about kind of uneven distribution of resources and political power over the country? And is there some sort of strategic, not just a kind of contingent reason, but some sort of strategic reason why these orders, their centers of power, are located outside the city, the capital?
Yeah, no, I was interested to understand what happened outside Cairo, because anyway, when I first did field work on Sufism in contemporary period, I refused to work on Cairo because most colleagues were working in Cairo, so I went to Upper Egypt. And the reason why, it's a long story, I can't start it. It's really by accident why I was studying Arabic, and we went on a trip to Upper Egypt as students, and we stayed for a month. And there I saw a gathering of people in front of the Sahat al-Sheikh Tayyib in Girga, and I was curious to know what's happening. And Sheikh al-Tayyib was dying, and the people were gathering, and there was such a huge crowd. And it happened, and I say, but who was Sheikh al-Tayyib? They say he was a saint, he was a Sufi, he was a saint. And I was shocked because I worked on Sufism and Sufi orders in Algeria during the colonization in 19th century, based on the French archives, and try to understand the role of the because of Abd al-Qadir and the role of the Sufi orders in the resistance against the Algerian colonization. But for me, I thought it was something of the past. And when I was told that the Sufi just died, I was really, I say, a Sufi? And then, so I said, so that's how I started working on the Khalwatiya. And I really wanted to understand how Sufism, and I saw, and they also mentioned that he was he was an Azhari, and that his son is a professor, doctor. Now he's Sheikh Al-Azhar, but he was doctor. And I was interested, not only I saw Sufi, but they were educated, and I met the son, and so I started working, and I really wanted to understand how culture were diffused outside Cairo to the countryside, and that's why I really wanted to continue working on Upper Egypt and trying to find out about the roots of this. Then I discovered manuscripts such as the Al-Maraghi manuscript, and I guess there are other manuscripts such as this. I know that he also wrote another history of Bani Adi, because Bani Adi gave so many scholars to Al-Azhar that he also wrote a manuscript of on Bani Adi and on Maragha, because there are also a lot of, but I'm sure that there are local histories of ulama and notables of the Delta, but they still lie in the libraries and waited to be explored. Yes, I really wanted to understand. I mean, the relationship, and also the reason why I wanted to work on Upper Egypt, because I'm such. I was a student of Garcin, and he was such an inspiring professor. And he did his PhD on Kous in Upper Egypt in the medieval period. What a fantastic work. And he based his PhD on Al-Utfoui. Al-Utfoui, who was Talia Said. And from Al-Utfoui, he managed to understand the rise and fall of an important Islamic center in Upper Egypt. So really not to be focused on Cairo, and so yeah, that was my inspiration. Yeah, I wanted to somehow continue at a lesser level. The work of Garcin on the side during the medieval period, and continue it during the Ottoman era. Yeah.
There's a question here, and then I might ask.
Thank you very much. I have a question about these interactions you were mentioning during the travels and so on, also in Upper Egypt. So I was wondering about interactions between the Sufis and Coptic monks. Especially, we have evidence also in Upper Egypt where there were Sufis in Coptic monasteries. So I was wondering about if you came in your sources about any connection between Sufism and Coptic monks or Coptic monasticism. And then you mentioned also a story about a young Copt, but I'm sorry, I think I've missed this part of the talk. So if you can also elaborate on that a bit.
No, the only story I have about interaction with Copt is the story of the true story, and it's Shir al-Mahdi, very well known, who was part of the Diwan and Bonaparte. He was brought. I mean, he wrote his own biography. He was brought. I don't know the circumstances, but he was given by his father, who was working for the Sheikh, to be brought up in his household, because it's interesting, because the Sheikh Al-Hifni had a household, because Al-Jabarti uses the word bait. So it's like Buyut al-Mamalik, you know, but, and just like, and he was brought up and raised by Sheikh Al-Hifni, and became a famous Sheikh and professor at Al-Azhar and member of the Diwan and Bonaparte. So this is the only interaction I mentioned about Sufis with Copts. I didn't come around anything else. Yeah.
So since I do have the mic, if we can go back to the question of framing. On last week on Saturday, part of your talk had to do with popularization, which is one of the frameworks in which we understand, or some scholars try to understand, social and cultural change in the late Middle Ages. But today you're also talking about a continuity of a tradition, and you are advising us against thinking of in very concrete and perhaps inflexible boxes about traditional versus reformist, etc. How do you bring those two different frameworks together? Are they different windows looking at the same scene? Are they realities of different time periods? Are they different people? When we speak of popularization, are we thinking of a certain participant in Sufi practice, whereas perhaps when we're thinking of the sheikhs themselves who are whose blessings, whose barakah is memorialized in the tabaqat and in the hagiographies, etc., we're talking about a different aspect of this social cultural experience?
Yeah, you almost answered the question by giving these examples. But I mean, the problem is the word Sufism. It really, we have to use it now. We can't do without it. Khalas, it's too. But Sufism doesn't mean anything. You know, even the Sufis were not using it. Sufis were ulama. They considered themselves as ulama. But they have another understanding of what is ilm. An understanding that was different than that of the jurists or that of the theologians. So they were in competitions between each others about, you know, what is the true understanding of Islam. But they didn't consider themselves like as Sufis. So because of this, the vision is blurred. One example, if I go back to my field work, when I went to Upper Egypt, that was the most striking thing that happened to me. So I went to Upper Egypt and I started doing my field work and I started asking to the people, I said, so are you a Sufi? And they, yeah, you know the answer. They say, no. I mean, I'm not. He thought that it was some kind of ideology, and he say, I'm a muhib al-sheikh. أنا من أحباب الشيخ. أولاد الشيخ. أصحاب الشيخ. ما فيش صوفي. Is sahaba, companionship, mahabba, love, أولاد, kind of spiritual filiation. So you have, of course, intellectual Sufism, like the books of Ibn Arabi and Jalaluddin Rumi, and Orientalists, they emphasize on these books, and they thought that was Sufism. But nobody had access to these books. Nobody could even, apart from a minority of masters and educated scholars, the vast majority were muhibbin, were ashab, but through, also, it's not because you're muhib or sahib that you're not conservative. You can even be Salafi, you know, and so the word Sufism, I mean, hide all the variety of relationships, devotions, piety, scholarship that there is under this whole culture. I don't know if I can express it.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I think we have to wrap up. Unfortunately, I think there are quite a few ideas and questions we can go on discussing, but perhaps we can do that over coffee. As I mentioned earlier, we also have a few books from AOC Press and FAO that you might want to look at over coffee and perhaps chat some more with Professor Chih. Thank you again so very much for this wonderful lecture, and thank you.